Share the PowerPoint. All right. So today we're going to take a quick peek at the 1700s. Last several weeks we've looked at the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s. And today we advance into the 1700s. And it's not so much limited to faith developments, but there was such an earthquake of a transition of thought that occurs in the 18th century during the 1700s that I felt that we could spend maybe one session on this, and it's a brief session, but nonetheless, and it also segues nicely into some of the topics that many of you are dealing with over the course of the weekend. And so maybe I'll even have a thought or two here that you might want to incorporate or at least think about in light of the various topics that you're going to be speaking on. But 18th century Enlightenment, does anybody have any thoughts before I dive into this PowerPoint of what you may have heard about the 18th century, the so-called Enlightenment, or the modern age that seemingly grows out of that? Maybe you studied Western civilization or history, world history. What was going on in the 18th century? Anybody? Or is this a total new revelation?
Well, I mean, I can remember some of the figures that we studied about in school whenever we were going through this period in history, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire and some of these philosopher guys that were postulating a lot of different intellectual arguments for the existence of humans and how we are born. Are we born like a blank slate? Are we born with innate things within us, or are we just products of our environment, and how do we fit in the world? So I kind of remember those aspects of it.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, this century was really the segue into the modern world, and now we're kind of in what's sometimes called the postmodern world, and then beyond that even. But the 18th century was a critical turning point from what might be called the Renaissance period into the modern period. And so let's just dive in. I think Caleb had a good summary there. The 18th century, the 1700s, is the century in which the United States was founded. It's the century of 1776. It's the century of the 1790s, where you have the French Revolution. It's the century of a whole lot of modern philosophers. And in many respects, it's the century that kind of turned the corner, where the secular arm of the Renaissance begins to supplant the religious arm of the Reformation as the dominant type of thinking, especially among intellectuals. It becomes the dominant force of intellectualism and in many respects popular culture. The leading thinkers of the day began to open the door to a secular worldview where you have a man-centered approach as opposed to a God-centered approach. That's not to say that all of these philosophers and thinkers were adamantly against the idea of God, but some of them thought that there should be a God for utilitarian purposes, simply to do what human beings wanted to do, rather than to wrap one's whole life around God, or the thought process that God wraps his whole life around us. You have a lot of deism that pops up in the 18th century, where God winds things up, gets things going, but doesn't really so much become a hands-on God, providentially concerned about the day-to-day affairs of our lives. And many of our founding fathers seem to have deist ideas, where God gets things into motion, but doesn't necessarily interact a whole lot necessarily in a providential sort of way. I think I got this from Wikipedia, but the Age of Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, or simply the Enlightenment, was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the world of ideas in Europe during the 18th century. The Enlightenment included a range of ideas centered on the pursuit of happiness, sovereignty of reason, and the evidence of the senses as the primary sources of knowledge, and advanced ideals such as liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. You notice several of those ideas are built into our founding documents. And key figures, many of which Caleb just mentioned: David Hume, John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Baruch Spinoza, Voltaire, among others. And so, kind of a summary statement is the Enlightenment stands out as one of the periods of human history that profoundly impacted and advanced our understanding of the world we live in. It was a time of dramatic upheaval in the disciplines of science, religion, philosophy, and politics. The voices of the Enlightenment championed science and reason as crucial for the pursuit of just societies. Just to give you a smattering, and this is just a snapshot of main ideas. You have kind of a utopian dream summed up in 5 words. And I think I got this from Wikipedia: reason, nature, happiness, progress, and liberty. And then the idea that man and society are perfectible, maybe even without God's help, with emphasis on human progress, human initiative, and a human-centric view of things, kind of a resurrection of the ancient Greek idea by Protagoras that man is the measure of all things. So it kind of decentralizes God and puts man at the heart of human activity. And along with it, at least not everybody has this view, but a lot of these leading thinkers did, a kind of a deistic view that God created the world, but hasn't got a whole lot of direct contact with it on a day-to-day basis. And that opened the door in turn to the idea of no revealed truth, no moral absolutes, and ultimately no God even. And so this is a smattering of quotes, very famous people of that time. I think, therefore I am, Descartes. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, Voltaire. Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains, Rousseau. It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong, Voltaire. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person, there can be no liberty. This is interesting and could be looked upon at from multiple angles, but our own founding father, Benjamin Franklin: rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Nothing in nature stands still. Everything strives and moves forward. Gottfried von Herder. Freedom is the alone unoriginated birthright of man and belongs to him by force of his humanity. Freedom, democratically and politically, big deal in that period. And this is the age when monarchies began to be overthrown, and democratic republics replaced them. The earth's creation is the glory of God as seen from the works of nature by man alone. And so again, this idea that God is still in the picture for the most part, but it's man that now has center stage to observe all these things and to assess them. If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him, Voltaire, because again, they saw God as a utilitarian necessity in many respects, most of these guys, that society would be disorderly if you didn't have God. And so we need him for that purpose, but not necessarily for a thoroughgoing faith. Some of these guys have kind of a deistic faith. To love truth for truth's sake is the principal part of human perfection in this world and the seed plot of all other virtues. So you follow the truth wherever it leads. Open investigation of truth, John Locke. Thomas Hobbes, men look not at the greatness of evil past, but the greatness of the good to follow. So they're optimistic rather than pessimistic in terms of the possibilities of the future. Francis Bacon, we cannot conceive of any end or limit to the world, but always as of necessity it occurs to us there is something beyond. So it was an age of discovery, an age of exploration, an age of almost unbridled liberty to turn loose the human spirit to explore and to discover new things. The intention of the Bible is to teach us how one goes to heaven, not how the heavens go, Galileo. I actually agree with that, but again, obviously he was pigeonholed and maligned for his views of the universe, and so that statement is used in that context. So the new challenges is theology loses its grip in the late medieval age, even into the early Renaissance. You have theology as the kind of the queen of the sciences in university, and now theology begins to take backseat to science, to human pursuits and human observation. Science becomes something of a new religion. Supernatural claims are questioned. I would say that probably Reagan has done a lot of thinking here about David Hume of late in light of his talk on Sunday. David Hume would challenge miracles philosophically. That occurs in the 1700s, the 18th century. Higher criticism of the Bible would turn in a skeptical direction, especially as you get into the 1800s. I mean, the 1800s, the 19th century. But the Enlightenment century would kind of pave the way for that. And so for the scriptures to be viewed as kind of a gradual evolutionary process apart from divine superintendence or divine guidance. And so therefore you have a new way to read the Bible with fresh eyes, fresh discovery. In some ways, this kind of paves the way to get beyond the rigors of denominationalism, including the Protestant denominations. On the other hand, people would take this in a different direction to get away from the Bible altogether, or from a certain respect for the authority of the Bible. So John Locke, on the one hand, favored an unprejudiced examination of the Word of God alone and a simple reading of Scripture, and that in turn would influence the back to the Bible approach of the Restoration movement in the early 1800s, and a questioning of denominational dogma. There are some liberal thinkers in Churches of Christ who question the hermeneutical starting point of command, example, necessary inference. And one of the favorite tactics is to trace that back to John Locke and say it's a Lockean philosophy, and really has no bearing on establishing authority for all our beliefs and practices. And I would counter argue that Locke kind of systematized that and kind of gave some rules of engagement for how logical thinking comes to certain conclusions, but that the idea of direct statements, examples or illustrations, and necessary implications and necessary inferences are the way that we have always reasoned as human beings. Had that discussion earlier today with Reagan. And I don't think that Locke discovered that as much as he kind of systematized it. He didn't invent it. He may have discovered it, or in the sense of kind of coming to that conclusion that that's how human logic works. But it's always worked that way, and that's intuitive to the way we are and the way we think. But that's another discussion. But anyway, that kind of thing was systematized in the 1700s, and you see the influence of that to a degree in the Restoration movement. But I believe it's a healthy influence. So I don't think everything in the 18th century is necessarily bad. The idea of questioning foundational assumptions, I think, is a good thing. But they took it too far, or opened the door to take it too far, and to leave God out of the picture. So in the Jefferson Bible, Thomas Jefferson went further and dropped any passages dealing with miracles, visitations of angels, the resurrection of Jesus, and tried to extract the practical Christian moral code of the New Testament from all the other superfluous details, and basically dissected part of the New Testament from everything else, and it didn't last long in terms of influence, because once you take the supernatural element of the Bible, you are bereft of much of the power of the Bible, and the narrative dialogues are there intertwined with the miracles. For instance, when you're examining the Gospel of John, Jesus will say, "I am the resurrection and the life," and he'll also, he'll bring Lazarus back from the dead. He'll say, "I am the light of the world," and he'll give sight to a blind man, or "I am the bread of life," after he feeds the 5,000. How can you separate the teachings, the claims, and the interactions of Jesus from his miracles, and come out with anything rock solid about what really happened? And a modern counterpart to that is the Acts of Jesus and the sayings of Jesus by the Jesus Seminar around the turn of the millennium. They basically did the same thing and eliminated all the elements of the Gospels that didn't fit their paradigm. But in any case, you see the beginnings of that in the 1700s. Reliance on personal reason. Number of novel ideas about religion developed within the Enlightenment, including deism, talk of atheism. According to Thomas Paine, deism is the simple belief in God the Creator with no reference to the Bible or any other miraculous source. Instead, the deist relies solely on personal reason to guide his creed, which was eminently agreeable to many thinkers of the time. So you have a lot of believers in God, but they tend to limit God and maximize human potential and human exploration. And so again, that opens the door to other possibilities that mostly I think are negative as the 18 and 1900s begin to play out. But again, most still believed in God, but atheism is increasingly discussed. The Age of Enlightenment, Voltaire held that without belief in God, who punishes evil, the moral order of society was undermined. That is, since atheists give themselves to no supreme authority and no law, had no fear of eternal consequences, they were far more likely to disrupt society. We see that playing out right now. I think he was right on that, but I wouldn't invent a God just to impose order on society. I believe there is objectively a true and living God that does that with or without our approval. Bale observed that in his day, prudent persons will always maintain an appearance of religion. And he believed that even atheists could hold concepts of honor and go beyond their own self-interest to create and interact in society. But again, the door is opened for a slippery slope, if you will, of not believing in God and the moral and spiritual consequences of that. So, by and large, Western civilization still considered itself Christian. And much of the rationale focused on the ordering of society in the here and now, not on the absolute truth and eternal issues in the hereafter. So you have a lot of practical believers in God, deists, that are among our founding fathers, many believers in God, and the idea of the freedom of the individual, free speech, freedom of religion, the amendments to our Constitution grow out of concepts of individual liberty that that they held very much in high esteem. And to tell you the truth, even though the 18th century kind of gets a bad rap because it opens the door for some social ills that long term of people abandoning God and so on, we are at a point in our history right now where that individual liberty and that ultimately is based on biblical principles, whether all of these 18th century philosophers realized it or not. We are now at a point where people are abandoning the plank even of those things in favor of other social justice models. And it almost makes me want to long for the good old days of the Enlightenment of the 18th century, even though I understand that there were some evils that were inherent in some of these things as well. John Locke said that if there were no God and no divine law, the result would be moral anarchy. Every individual could have no law but his own will, no end but himself. He would be a God to himself, and the satisfaction of his own will, the sole measure and end of all his actions. Again, I think we see that playing out in our society today. European churches were tied to the state, even when the monarchies began to give way to democratic republics. And there was much talk of separation of church and state, but in Europe, for the most part, church and state were still intertwined. The separation of church and state as a social experiment really occurred right here in the United States of America. So churches in Europe had a monopoly, and Christianity in Europe tended to wither because there was no healthy competition. And Rodney Stark, the sociologist, has written a number of good books on that. Where there is no competition, he suggests, religions tend to get fat and comfortable with the status quo, and they end up not meeting people's true needs. And whether you subscribe to that or not, it's an interesting idea to think about, that even though we're not in a competition-free zone, the fact of competition and the fact of false teaching side by side with the truth tends to make Christians stronger, because we have to deal with the consequences of error. And Europe lacked that. And so in the 1700s, first half of the 18th century, William Hogarth paints this or does this woodcut of the sleeping church. You have the King James Bible coming out in 1611, but by the beginnings of the 1700s, English people were sleeping in church. And it's a caricature, but nonetheless, you have a lot of that religious fervor and even respect for the King James Bible taking off rather in the United States of America rather than in Great Britain from that point forward. Because I think the Enlightenment, even though you still have an Anglican church in England and you still have conservative Bible believers, over time, the lack of healthy competition and and the church and state being somewhat intertwined, you have a weakening of popular Christianity over time, so that what you see in England, let's say by the beginning of the 1900s, compared to what you see in the United States beginning in the 1900s, doesn't compare. And in the modern situation, even the the level of practical atheism in England is almost universal, and diehard conservative Anglicans are almost totally missing. And so again, the way is paved, I think, way back when. So, the bottom line, and I'm not going to spend a long time on this lesson, but the good versus the bad. I think the good, on the positive side of things, the Enlightenment valued individual freedom and underscored the rights of man. It challenged the old monarchies and established democratic republics. And one other good I forgot to put on here. I really think it paved the way for the American Restoration movement. That the idea of free investigation and opening the Bible with fresh eyes paved the way for the Restoration movement in America to take off in the early 1800s. And I need to add that to this chart here. But on the negative side, the Enlightenment put the central focus on human beings and de-emphasized God, which in turn paved the way for Darwin's general theory of evolution in the 1800s, as well as for higher criticism to propose a human evolutionary development of the biblical text as opposed to divine superintendence. And it eventually rewired society to try to do away with God altogether. And so on balance, I think that the long-term effects are negative, but the short-term effects, you do see a few positives. Hope that makes some sense. I'm trying to look at this a little more nuanced, but I believe it to be true. In some ways, the Enlightenment philosophers remind me of the Sadducees of the New Testament, who know neither the Scripture nor the power of God. And or Pilate in John 18:38, what is truth? And in some ways, the so-called age of reason put theology on the defensive and opened the door to a deistic or an outright atheistic view of the universe. And in terms of objective moral absolutes, they kept God in the picture for a while because it was convenient for society to operate that way. But they removed the foundation for it. You take God out of the picture and engaged God out of the picture, and moral absolutes in the Bible out of the picture, and you're left with eventually a society that has no moral absolutes and goes into chaos. And again, we see the consequences in our own society today of that very thing. And then finally, here in John 1 through 18, and this may morph into Nick's lesson on Sunday night, but we learned that we cannot break the barrier between the world of our five senses and the supernatural realm. No one has seen God at any time. We can't just barge into the supernatural realm and see God. However, just because we cannot pierce this barrier from our end does not mean that God cannot traverse it from his end. And I often make this point when we're studying with people in the Silicon Valley today. I'll use this chart here that people posit a physical universe and dismiss the supernatural dimension, even though quantum physics and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and a whole lot of other things in science would open the door for a supernatural dimension. And there are a number of theoretical physicists that have opened that door. So, but there are others that just dismiss out of hand, as Harvard's Richard Lewontin had said a generation ago. we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The proper way to view this is that we're limited by our five senses, and we cannot see beyond them and experience the supernatural on our own, apart from God reaching down to us. But he can break the barrier, and he has broken the barrier. And what John 1 through 18 says is that the eternal word has entered into time and space in the person of Jesus. And God has come down to our level, revealed himself in the word, revealed word, and in the person of Jesus, and left supernatural fingerprints in our realm that we can see. Just because we cannot pierce that barrier doesn't mean it's a barrier to God at all. And I would even argue that our universe is a spiritual realm. It's just that we're limited by our five senses to be able to experience the fullness of it right now, by our own unaided powers. But that doesn't limit God in any way. And if we're open to the idea of God penetrating that barrier, coming down to our level, then there's a whole world of possibilities that we can explore. And we can explore them with the tools that God has given us. But it's always in view of a God who does interact with us supernaturally. And which again is, and they're getting away from that idea in the 18th century. But I would again propose these ideas as a countermeasure to some of those thoughts. And maybe I've touched on a thing or two that you could at least incorporate or think about as you put the finishing touches on these lessons this next weekend. But nonetheless, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it here. So questions or comments? Hey, we got all five speakers, I think. That's good. Are you all set for your sermons this weekend? Good. Super. We're looking forward to that, and invite those members of the congregation over here. And if this goes well here, maybe we can export this to where you are. Do something similar in your own congregation. No, Matt's not here. Okay. So I'll send him the recording. But any final thoughts, reactions to the 18th century? Next week, we're going to get into the Restoration movement. And it's the next logical thing, beginning of the 1800s, and what's happening in the United States of America and this Restoration movement that begins taking off. All right. Well, you all have a good week. I thought I'd keep it short today because busy week for the four of you. And so we'll see you come this weekend. Take care.